Hey everybody, welcome back to Leosophy. This is, I think, the last in the psychology series, at least for now. I'm going to be talking about schizophrenia, which is easily the most pronounced and famous, and I would argue the most dramatic of all the psychological conditions that, at the very least, are in mainstream parlance. And it's more broad than a lot of people think. But to start, let's get rid of some of the misconceptions. The most common misconception, because of the film Psycho, it's caused a lot of misconceptions with psychopathy and schizophrenia, because near the end of the movie they straight up say that he's a psycho and that he has schizophrenia and that manifests by him having multiple personalities. Well, multiple personalities and schizophrenia are not the same thing. And psychopathy and schizophrenia are also not the same thing. I mean, it's really apples and oranges. Really, schizophrenia is characterized by a combination of behaviors, the most notable of which is hallucinations, which that in and of itself is often misunderstood. Because when people think of hallucinations, they generally think of seeing things. Well, I'd say less than 1% of schizophrenics actually see things. Most of these hallucinations are auditory. Usually, what they perceive as objective reality is often interfered with by these hallucinations, and it often leads to conclusions that are outlandish or terrifying to someone who isn't afflicted by schizophrenia. A great example, I've known people who have schizophrenia and have observed them, and they will be watching something that's completely benign, like the news, and they'll begin insisting strange things about the news, like that newscaster is drunk, that newscaster is a kidnapper, that newscaster has a woman in his basement. They'll just start saying things and you're wondering, like, where are they getting this information? Well, they're getting it from a combination of things, actually. One, they're getting it from hallucinations, often auditory. And also they're getting it because, and this is the most fascinating thing about schizophrenia in my opinion, the way they organize and structure and evaluate information is vastly different from the way the average person does. So, let me give you a hypothetical situation. Let's say you are sitting in a coffee shop, and at one table is a schizophrenic, and you're having a coffee, and somebody barges in with a gun, or actually, let me start over, because this will make more sense. Again, I'm kind of making this up as I go along. You're in a coffee shop, and the barista comes over, and you ask for a light roast, and she says, okay. And she goes over to the schizophrenic, and he asks for dark roast, and she says, I'm sorry, we're all out, we only have light roast. So he orders light roast. So the barista goes back to make the coffee, and somebody pops in with a gun and starts, threatening everyone. Get on the ground. Everyone get on the ground. And he has the barista empty the register, and everybody's terrified, and then the subject leaves, and the police get there, and they start questioning people. The average person will say, I don't know what happened. They just came in, and they started pointing guns at people, etc., or whatever. The schizophrenic, on the other hand, if they ask them, they might ask, any idea as to why the perp may have done that? They might say, well, because they didn't have any dark roast. That seems really outlandish for someone who's not afflicted with this. But the reason for this is because they don't categorize information as unimportant. Like the barista's forgotten, in that moment. They don't even have dark roast. What's more important is the gunman, right? But for the schizophrenic, all the information that they're receiving, everything, the color of the barista's dress, the fact that the door was squeaking when they entered, every little bit of information is all treated equally. Same thing with memories. Memories are all evaluated equally. So, seeing a fly on the wall and then an immediate earthquake afterwards, those are equal. Those are both going to be put in with the same deference in the hippocampus. So this is one of the things that leads to these what we would regard as outlandish conclusions by people with schizophrenia, is because They're deeming all the information equal. They're not filtering out things that are deemed unimportant or uninteresting or unrelated. And that's where you get these peculiar conclusions. These things sort of add up like a Katamari ball. And so then they start saying things where you're like, what do you mean? You know, they'll say something like, the mayor is a shapeshifter. He takes his skin off every evening. I know this because of all the salt in his soup. And you just want, and there's rhyme to that. There's rhyme and reason to that madness. You know, they've observed things and they've all added up, but then the conclusion, which is tangential to what they're saying, ultimately is unrelated. And they've done experiments with this with computer software, by making computer software treat all incoming information equally and not forgetting anything, not deleting anything, no matter how irrelevant. They'll have that. What they end up with is this software that will make really outlandish conclusions. At one point, I think they got a computer to admit that it was responsible for 9/11 or something, and it did this because it was treating all information equally and not deleting anything that was irrelevant. Additionally, schizophrenia has probably, I would definitely say, the most dramatic physical effects on the brain. You can often see mental differences between people with different afflictions, different psychological conditions. But with schizophrenia, it's very dramatic. There are actually holes in the brain. It's actually very similar to brain prions in that regard, except it doesn't generally worsen. The real danger for schizophrenics, and it's a shame, people often attribute it to suicide, but really, more often than not, like when they run in front of a bus or a car or a train, really they're running because one of those auditory hallucinations frightened them into running, made them think that they were actually escaping danger. So it's a real shame when people attribute their what appears to be self-destructive behavior to being suicidal. Most of the time it's actually stemming from, and this is something that goes hand in hand with schizophrenia very often, paranoid behaviors stemming from these hallucinations. So it's really more, they're actually acting out of self-preservation, not self-destruction. It's just because it's so marred by all of the peculiarities associated with hallucinations and odd conclusions that we, from the outside, think it's self-destructive. We think that they're actually doing something to deliberately harm themselves rather than actually out of self-preservation. And there are many different kinds of schizophrenia. Paranoia is one common indication, but it's not the only kind. In fact, one of the most bizarre kinds, I highly recommend people look into this because it's a real rabbit hole, is catatonic schizophrenia. It's chilling to watch, but the behavior is very different. It's everything, every behavior, every mannerism is just greatly reduced, almost to the point where they appear to be like sentient mannequins. Just very slow, very, I would argue, too objective. Like the conclusions aren't usually correct. That just like with every other aspect of schizophrenia, they're based on tangential information rather than direct information. But the way they go about expressing it almost feels as if they're a detached observer remarking on unrelated events, even though they're actually talking about their own experiences in their own lives. It's very interesting, catatonic schizophrenia. There's a chilling video about it. I'll try and link it, but I don't know if I'll be able to find it or if I'll be allowed to link it. But yeah, the bottom line really is to cover some of the most common misconceptions about schizophrenia. One, schizophrenia is sort of, there's a genetic precursor, but it's often not instigated but catalyzed, I would say, by trauma and often subsequent attempts to correct the trauma through drug use. Heavy drugs are very common in schizophrenics' lives. More often than not, though, and this is where it gets murky, it's not necessarily the drugs that are causing it. Oftentimes the drugs are meant to treat a trauma that is often the root cause. But it's sort of a chicken and egg thing, because then there's the question of, well, we also have these schizophrenics who suffered trauma but didn't correct, and they don't have the same symptoms. They're much, much lighter. Well, in that case, it's clearly been exacerbated by drug use. So the bottom line is there are multiple underlying causes, and I hope that I've cleared up some of the misconceptions surrounding it. But other than that, there's not a lot that I could flesh out without turning it into, again, a very, very, very long episode. But yeah, that about covers it. Like, share, subscribe, keep asking questions. Bye.